George Hess, as well as designing and building the church here, he designed and built the clock. And this is the first of 3 tower clocks that he had built. It's the most primitive clock in the church in Zurich. A lot of the parts were ordered in, just stock parts. They were made by machinery manufacturers and that sort of thing. But a lot of the clock was hand built. And you can tell by the frame and everything else that it is a pretty primitive clock. Compared to the clocks in Sebastopol and the Exeter Town Hall, they're oak frames and nicely finished and all the rest. And but he had made improvements in his technique over the few years from 1878 up till about 1888 or so, where he built the Exeter Town Hall clock. The clock here has been operating pretty well continually since he built it, and there was a number of years that it was stopped during the winter months for fear of the hands, because the hands are just a very light sort of cedar. I think they're cedar. They've been painted many times, but as far as I know, they're the original hands on the clock that were put up there in 1878. So obviously the ice and that didn't bother him too much.
I'm Alma Westlake, and yes, I've become very interested in this restoration project. And it's a challenge because we as a committee feel very strongly that we have a unique heritage artifact that needs to be preserved for future generations. And it's very interesting the way George Hess designed this clock tower. Obviously, he designed the clock tower when he was doing the plans for the church. And he has a double protection, and this was identified by an engineer who came through the tower with us, and he said, oh look, he has 2 protections. The first protection for the clock is the roof immediately over it, or that would be the floor of the lantern. And we sort of have to think in terms of the outside external view in this regard. So the ceiling of the clock itself is the floor of the lantern, and the lantern is the area that houses the bells, which are directly connected to the clock. And then above the lantern is the spire, of course, and that's the second protection. So in terms of roofs over the clock, it's very well protected, and the brick walls themselves of the tower are 4 bricks thick. So he had put a lot of thought into the plans for not only the church, the tower, and the clock. He combined them and knew what his final outcome. We hoped his final outcome would be.
Clocks in both Sebastopol and Exeter have been decommissioned and electric works put in their place. In both cases, the works of the clock have been brought down to the ground level where they can be toured. The one in Exeter is at the entrance to the public library in Exeter. So anybody wanting to see a town hall clock that George built, that's available. And also at Sebastopol, they have that. It's available for tours as well, but not quite as public as obviously the one in Exeter.
The clock is very unique in Canada, and we've mentioned that previously, but it is one of 3 Canadiana clocks which are still operational in their original manner. These Canadiana clocks were determined by Graham Jones, who is an engineer and clock specialist, and he's still alive. He lives in Toronto.
Graham Jones wrote an article for the Clock Collectors magazine back in the, I think in the 70s, and no, it was actually in the 90s, 95 or thereabouts. And so the clock is well recognized in Canada as a Canadiana clock. It's, he built 3 and there were 7 similarly built, and I guess in order to fill the criteria they had to be Canadian made by Canadian craftsmen. So many of the tower clocks that are operating or were operating were works that were imported from England and France, maybe even Germany and Switzerland, but these were original clocks built in Canada by Canadian craftsmen.
Basically, the criteria for the Canadiana clocks has been touched on before, but it deals with clocks made by a Canadian, of Canadian materials in Canada, and certainly our clock qualifies, all of the George Hess clocks qualify. Each of the George Hess clocks were part of the 7 Canadiana clocks that were identified. The only remaining clocks now, I mentioned 3. The first one is the Citadel clock in Halifax. The second one is the Christchurch Cathedral clock in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And ours, the Hess clock.
I'm Dorothy Hess from Zurich, and my husband Gordon was the great-grandson of George Hess, who built the tower clock in our Lutheran church. George Hess was born, I believe it was 1837, in Germany, and at 16 he went to Switzerland to learn the clock trade. A few years later, I'm not sure what the date was, but he was quite young. He brought his wife. Her name was Christina, and his son Christian. They came across on the ship, and his wife Christina, there was a disease, got on the ship, and many of them died, and she passed away. She was buried at sea. They came to New York Harbor, and they were kept on the ship for I don't know how long, until they got this disease under control. They couldn't let anyone off, which of course made sense because they were all going in different directions. He brought the son, and they came by way of Buffalo to the Waterloo area, I think, to start with, and then ended up in Hay Township. And they settled in what was called Bern, which is now Blake. And Blake is a little hamlet just a few miles northwest of Zurich. Now he was in the carpentry business at that point. And according to the records, it was about 10 years later, he went back to Germany again to get tools of the trade, and came back. He had 2 brothers with him. He had a Fred Hess with him, who built many of the homes in Zurich later on then. And I think the other brother's name was Martin. They got into New York Harbor, would you believe? This ship upset, and he lost half of the possessions that he went to Switzerland to get. But what he had left, they traveled, came back to this area.
He had a very important role in the community because he was, number one, a carpenter, and then he became a clockmaker of varying kinds of, like the tower clock and the first electric clock. And then he was a meteorologist. He became a photographer, and he served the community in a lot of different areas.
I think it was in 1888 that he got the patents through for the tower clocks. And at that time, he built the one for the Lutheran church here. He built the one for the Lutheran church in Sebastopol, which is just Tavistock area, and the Exeter town clock. And he patented those in 1888. And in 1889, he started with electric clocks to run in unison. And he also had those patented. As I say, that was 1889, a year later. And those clocks and the patents and the certificate of the patents, my husband, they were in our basement at the house. And Gordon always said, these should be in a museum. And it never got done until after Gordon passed away. He was only 63 back in 1992. And I got in touch with the curator at the museum. And they have quite a nice display in Godrich at the museum on George Hess and his clocks and some of the generations. So he accomplished quite a bit while he was living, and he died with blood poisoning, so I think it was quite suddenly. And he must have been well respected in the town, because I can see the children, they got a holiday from school for his funeral. Now, can't you see all the children? They wouldn't care about George Hess at all, but the fact they got a holiday, it would be wonderful. And apparently they marched in single file at his funeral.
He was a very diligent, generous man, and was certainly a very vital part of this community in the 1870s, 70s, 60s, until his death.
Over the years, there's been several people looked after the clock. I guess Albert and Margaret Hess probably had the longest duration of care for it. Albert was, I think, a nephew of George Hess, and I've looked after it probably for about 30 years now, so I'm not sure what's going to happen after I move. I have someone looking after it or taking on the chore. Some weeks I go up once, and if there are any problems in that, I've been known to be up 3 or 4 times a day for several days, you know, until I find out what's going on and get it going again. But there's been many trips in 30 years, although that's all I know. It's quite a bit of work. The tower clock, this tower clock built by George Hess, was completed in 1878. It's a what they call primitive. All of the parts, the standard wheels here were ordered in just as standard parts from some of the companies that made farm equipment. Most of the rest of it is all handcrafted. You can tell with the end of the arms here, the wooden gears that were handcrafted. Over the years on this side, the wooden was replaced with aluminum because of the weather on the south side of the tower here. The escapement was handmade. George probably crafted that in his shop here in town, and everybody remarks about how primitive it is. I just take it as it is because that's the way it's always been. Another primitive gear is the star gears, transferring the clock movement to the clock faces. Very new, very modern. It was handcrafted by a gentleman that lives just north of town. It replaces that gear over there, which is the original. It was just worn beyond repair, so this is very, very new. in the belfry, there are 2 bells, but the original largest bell is what the clock strikes on. It can be heard for quite a distance, depending on which way the wind's blowing. Yeah, the bells are above us. There's 2 bells, but the clock, of course, just rings on the one, the largest of the 2. Some of these things are embellishments just to get it so that it starts. There's enough weight on this arm to get it going. That was always hanging there. We could have replaced it with something, but we decided to leave the original there. The face of the clock is immediately outside. That's the original wood that was installed back in the 1870s. So, except for this gear here, that was just built in the last few years. So it was made by local craftsmen. The dark wood is the original one from 1878. Handcrafted handles to crank up the weights. This dates back from 1878 as well. You can tell that was hand forged there. That side there gives a good idea.
Yeah, that was the imperfection. Just
Yeah. And then that just fits on the axle there, and you wind it up. And that'll take about 6 days to fall to the floor below, gradually. The south side of the tower gets the most weather that's damaging to the wood, so the aluminum gears replace the original wood. And this was done by Art Golding, a teacher at Beale Tech in London. And this was done in the 1950s.
It's obviously the most primitive, but it is truly Canadian, and we're very proud of that. And we think it's very important to preserve this unique heritage artifact. And there are some things, some areas where restoration and repairs are necessary. Obviously, the clock faces require some attention. They either replacement or restoration, we're not sure at this point, but they are tongue and grooved, and they are beveling, and they are weathered in 136 years. The spire needs recladding, and there are some holes in it. Some moisture will get in, and this is going to threaten the actual clock. And the other area that is in need of repairs is the lantern itself. So basically, it is this double protection that George has planned that is being threatened by 136 years of weathering, and we want to correct that so that the clock can continue to serve the whole community and the extended community for many years to come.
With the work that was done by the local clock group, the clock itself is in pretty good repair, except for the faces. We've left that to be incorporated into the work that we're doing on the tower. But the clock itself, a lot of the end of the axles were all rebushed, or new bushings put in. And so they figured it's good for probably another 60, 70 years without too much trouble. And we replaced that mechanism on the top of the clock for dispersing the power to the hands, so that it will last a long time as well. The original part there was just pretty well worn out.
I think the clock is important to the whole town because it's a timepiece, and originally it was the manner in which people were called to work. And for instance, the lunch hour was marked at 12 and 1, so that was very audible. And when at this point, when people are working in their gardens or outside early in the morning when there is not other noise, you hear that bell ring, and you know immediately what time it is. I was working with my grandchildren just last week, and they said, "Oh, Grandma, that means it's 12 o'clock, doesn't it?" And I said, "Yes, it does," because coming from a city, they don't hear those sounds, and it was a unique experience for them.
I think the whole community, it's a town clock. It's not just a Lutheran clock, it's a town clock for the whole community. So I think it's a wonderful legacy.